Tonight, I'm going to see the much anticipated revenge movie, Peppermint. Oh boy. Well, until I see that, let's talk about The Nun, because I saw that, and I'm gonna, unfortunately, see it next week as well. Hooray! Well, The Nun is the newest addition to the Conjuring cinematic universe. Because nowadays everything needs a cinematic universe. Every big franchise. Yeah. Well, very similar to the doll Annabelle, The Nun was pretty creepy in The Conjuring. And so, just like Annabelle, The Nun gets its own side story. Because we really need to see the origins of a creepy demon that takes the shape of a nun. The story is simple. The Nun is set in 1952, and this is before the Conjuring movies, before the Annabelle and its prequel. And chronologically, this is the first film. So there's this very creepy, very ancient, very isolated monastery in Romania. And unfortunately, a nun commits suicide. Well, the hanging corpse of this nun is found and is reported, and so now the Vatican wants a priest, and this one woman who's trying to be a nun is learning to be, but she hasn't taken her vows yet. They want these two to investigate and see what is going on. But as they investigate this monastery, creepy things, supernatural things start to happen, and we may be dealing with something that is unholy ground. As much as I like the two Conjuring films, I never felt the need for there to be a cinematic universe or some origin story of these creepy supernatural enemies that briefly show up in the Conjuring movies. And out of the three side stories that we've had so far, there's only one of them that's proven to be really good, and that's the prequel to Annabelle. So really, Annabelle creation is the only thing that makes this cinematic universe worthwhile so far. Now, I didn't hate The Nun. I can see why a lot of people really hate it, and were probably very disappointed with it, because The Nun is a creepy character. She's pretty creepy looking, and a lot of people were very scared by her in The Conjuring 2. And some of that was nice because there was more of a mystery to her, and you don't really know too much about her other than she's very scary. And so a lot of people were probably expecting this movie to be very scary and make a good origin story for the nun, but for me, I can see why many people could have been disappointed by it. That being said, The Nun, one of the things it definitely has going for it is better than the first Annabelle. Some people seem to forget that that movie exists, because a lot of people are saying The Nun is the worst of this cinematic universe, and I can see where it's the most disappointing. Worst? No. That goes to Annabelle. Alright, so what did I ultimately like about The Nun? There's some decent cinematography. The lighting, the atmosphere is pretty creepy at times. The whole setting of the monastery is really, it really looks like this really ancient, dark, evil place to be in. So basically, I like the lighting, I like the setting, I like the cinematography. The acting was pretty good. I didn't care too much about the characters, but the acting, the performances, I liked them. Both the practical effects and the visual effects were pretty decent, especially some of the zombie-looking corpses. One of the things I like about some horror movies is when something very creepy and very subtle happens in the background. When the camera is actually focused on our main character rather than the creepy thing happening in the background. And so the background is so subtle and so minute but still creepy, that it feels like it's something you're discovering rather than the filmmakers pointing it out, here, look, something creepy right behind them. There's one moment in this film when the girl, our main character, the one wanting to become a nun, is all alone in the monastery part where she's in a bed, and she wakes up and she thinks she sees the nun that committed suicide, which could be visions, could be an illusion, could be the demon making this illusion. But anyway, she sees her, and as she's getting out of the bed, the cross behind her slowly turns upside down, implying that, yeah, the nun has something to do with that, because whenever Valak enters the room, crosses overturn. I like that little detail, and it's a very minute, very small thing that happens, but to be honest, that was the scariest thing in this movie, which was mildly creepy. And as much as this film does become sort of big, dumb, almost action-type horror film, I wouldn't say action like Aliens per se, but action in... It's something you'd expect more from a big summer blockbuster, but in the context of a supernatural horror film where people are getting thrown around by the nun, a lot of things are happening, a lot of running or a lot of confronting visions and apparitions. Something a little bit more faster paced, something a little action packed, which makes it kind of dumb and weird, and something more fast paced, something more action packed. It does make it go dumb, but the escalation is there in this movie, and it made the last half of the film kind of entertaining, even though I do like my slow build horror films, more so than the fast paced ones. But one of the things that I really liked about this film, and also one of the things that are most disappointing about this film, is that it had a lot of potential, especially with some of the backstories this movie tries to tell. There's a lot more interesting stories in the backstories than we have our main story. Like, I'd really rather have a story about the nuns dealing with this demon entity before our main characters arrive. That felt like it could have been a better story than what we got. I mean, there's a lot of technical aspects to the film that I liked, and I did like the performances, but ultimately, there still is a lot of bad, especially since this is a horror film, and it wasn't all that scary. Okay, let's talk about the jump scares. I know a lot of people are annoyed with jump scares, and I totally understand that. A really bad jump scare could just really ruin the mood, and ruin the tension, and just ruin the movie. And there is a lot of horror movies out there that rely too heavily on jump scares. I understand the annoyance, but there is a few jump scares out there that can work, and one of the movies that proved it this year is Insidious: The Last Key. I thought all the jump scares in that movie was actually handled really well, very suspenseful, and sometimes the jump scare you're expecting it to happen and it doesn't even happen at all, which made things a little bit more unpredictable when it comes to those jump scares. And to boot, the supernatural element of the movie was pretty horrifying in of itself. The horror element of this demon and what happened to the monastery before the people arrive, and a few of the other things are pretty horrifying, cliched and generic at times, but pretty horrifying. So I'm not too annoyed with the jump scares in this movie, especially since there's no fake jump scares where it's like a bird flies into our view, or a cat jumps out of the darkness, or something really stupid like that. But all the jump scares that were in this movie were very predictable, and there's only one jump scare in this entire thing that I legitimately jumped at, and that was one that I wasn't expecting, and it was basically these hands coming through the door and almost grabbing our main character. Well, grabbing, but she escapes. That's the only one that made me jump. One of the things that make the two Conjuring movies entertaining for me and compelling to me is because I care about the main characters. There's enough depth to them, enough complexity, and enough humanization that I do like our main characters and I want to see them prevail. Now, where the performances of this movie were good and there were enough to make me like the characters a little bit, and that tries to have enough backstory to really make you root for some of these characters, but for the most part, I found the characters themselves and the way the movie builds them to be pretty bland and forgettable. Another thing that I really didn't like about The Nun is that there's many times where it feels like it breaks its own rules. You know, I couldn't quite figure out the extent of the nun's supernatural powers. Yes, she's a demon, so she's probably all-powerful and very gifted in all of these illusions and deceivery and all these other things. And yes, I know it's a horror film and it's not a superhero film, but horror films have their rules too. When you set up a fantasy, when you set up something in your film, and you gotta stick with it because it becomes a rule. Like, for example, there's this rule set up early on that she can't pass when there's a bunch of crosses, and she can't leave the monastery. But then several times it feels like it breaks her rules, and you start realizing, wait, what's the extent of her powers? Is this all just illusion that's beyond the monastery? Is this all illusion? But why are people still getting hurt? Why is it still effective? Can she really make the dead rise? What is she doing? There's several moments where it feels like the movie breaks its own rules for plot convenience. And I know that that's probably not a big deal for some people, especially if they just want supernatural horror. I understand that, but for me it felt like there wasn't a really good establishment of the rules that this movie sets out to have, making a lot of the events in this movie quite confusing on how it's actually happening. Another thing I surprisingly didn't like was the musical score for this movie, and The Nun has her own theme in this movie. And I think it was still a theme in The Conjuring 2, but The Nun doesn't show up as much in The Conjuring 2 as she shows up in this movie. And so every time she shows up and it has this very dark or very choir-like music happening whenever she arrives, is very boding, very ominous choir chanting. It becomes a little bit annoying every time she shows up and every time this score happens, to the point where it started becoming comical rather than haunting. Like, there's this moment at the very end where she rises out of the water and this dark, foreboding music happens, and I had to stifle laughter. And yes, this movie does connect with the Conjuring films, but it does it in such a small, lazy, sort of lame way that it makes me wonder what's the point of connecting to the movie anyway. Just have her get released. Just have her possess someone and get released. We don't need that person to come in contact with. I guess you kind of do, because, I don't know. It just, the way they did it felt pretty lame. It's almost like that same kind of thing that happens when you make a standalone movie, right? Not meaning to be a franchise, because the first Conjuring, it was not meant to really start this whole universe, cinematic universe. It was just a horror movie, right? And it's like when more sequels and more prequels happen, they're like, all right, we got to somehow connect to this somehow. And they're like, well, we're going to find these very little minute things that happen and try to connect it in that way, which in turn is kind of smart, but at the same time feels kind of lame. There's a lot more things that I didn't like about the film, and a lot more things that I found this movie had a lot of potential, but it just throws that potential away. But unfortunately, almost all those things that I want to talk about are pretty spoiler heavy. But ultimately, I think I'm going to have to give The Nun 2.5 stars. Overall, it's pretty average, and that average sort of feel for the movie might be extremely disappointing for a lot of people, and so that's probably why they absolutely hate this film, because of that disappointment level. But I didn't have too high hopes going into this in the first place, and so it kind of met my expectations a little bit. So 2.5. So, did you see The Nun? What'd you think about it? Go ahead and comment below. And if you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe and check out my movie reviews or countdowns of this year or previous years, whatever you'd like to see. And as always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.